everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the CARES Act and Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. We appreciate you being here, and FAS has waited a little while to present a webinar on this information just because we've really been trying to wait for the department to provide some more clear guidance, answer some of our questions and that sort of thing, but at this point it's not really coming. So we have decided to go ahead and get the information out to you guys. It's really the same information that we've been sending to you in email form, but we wanted to put it all in one place and give you all of the most recent guidance that we have and give the opportunity to ask questions. Once the webinar is over, we will post a copy of the recording, the PowerPoint, and a transcript of the Q&A for your reference. And if you have any questions at all, you can certainly either call the office or email the compliance team at complianceteam@fastinc.net. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing I wanted to do was go over a timeline of events, just so you kind of know where everything is coming from. It was probably back in February that the coronavirus really started to become a thing and start affecting the way schools were operating. At the beginning of March, on the 5th of March, the Department of Education released an electronic announcement that provided guidance for the interruptions of study due to the coronavirus. On March 13th, President Trump declared the coronavirus a national emergency, and on 3/27, the CARES Act was signed, and the CARES Act is what created the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. On April 3rd, the department released another electronic announcement that provided some updated guidance for interruptions of study related to coronavirus. On 4/9, the Department of Education announced the availability of the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund for students. And on 4/21, they announced the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund for schools and the ability for the schools to go ahead and apply for those two funds. On 4/30, an electronic announcement was provided with more updated and clarified guidance for interruptions of study. And on 5/6, the department announced interim reporting guidance for the HEERF student funds. And then on 5/15 was the most recently received electronic announcement that provided additional updates and clarification on the guidance for interruptions of study. There was also sort of an undercover announcement that came out on 5/21 that was posted to the CARES Act website, which we'll get into in a little bit. So we'll start first with the guidance for interruptions of study, distance education being one of the most important to our schools, of course. So this flexibility gave broad approval to the schools to offer distance education without having to go through the Department of Ed's official application process. This broad approval is good through December 31st. It is only good if the schools also have approval from their accrediting agency and their states. It's really important that you have that documented approval as well. It's also really important for schools to have a solid process for tracking attendance. If your school is required to take attendance, or if you're a clock hour school, it's really, really important that you have a really solid way to track your students' attendance. Of course, the Department of Education requires 50 minutes of instruction per 60 minutes in order to give the student credit for an hour. So you have to have some way to make sure that the students are actually engaged for 50 out of 60 minutes. So if you're doing maybe face-to-face Zoom sort of instruction, that's a great way to do it. You may have another online learning platform that you're using. If the students are doing more of an independent study kind of thing, you do have to have a way to check in with them. I was on a webinar with NACIS, and they were telling schools that it would be best to be touching base with your students at least every hour and seeing if they have questions and just making sure that they are engaged. Whether you do that through email or phone call, video call, things like that, you just need to make sure that you're documenting everything. And we can't stress enough the need for documentation. So whatever documentation you have of the hours that students are attending, even if you're transferring them into your school management software, it's going to be really important that you have backup for anything that you manually enter into your school management software. So just make sure you have your documentation, retain it in accordance with the department's record retention regulations. Satisfactory academic progress is another flexibility that the department is offering. They're allowing schools to exclude from the quantitative measure, which is your PACE measurement, any attempted credits that the student was unable to complete due to COVID. So this really pertains, I think, more to a term-based school where maybe the student had started the spring term and was unable to complete it because the school closed and the student wasn't able to do distance ed or something to that effect. Schools can exclude these credits from the initial SAT calculation rather than using them as a basis for appeal. And the credits can also be excluded from the maximum time frame calculation. And again, that can be done up front rather than using it as a basis for appeal. For schools that cease operations altogether, any credits or hours specific to that closure period may be excluded as well. Return of Title IV funds is a big one, and one that I think is causing a little bit of confusion for schools. This flexibility allows schools to waive the return of unearned funds for students who withdraw due to COVID. Now, what schools have to remember is that the most recent electronic announcement that came out did kind of narrow that time period down. And it says that the students have to withdraw from a payment period that begins on or includes the date of March 13th. So that's really important. You need to make sure that that March 13th date falls within the payment period that the student dropped from. If they begin after March 13th, it would not apply to them. If they were enrolled prior to March 13th, but they withdrew from a subsequent payment period that began after March 13th, it wouldn't apply to those students either. Now, if you have a student who falls into this category, students who went from ground-based to distance education instruction, the school can assume that the withdrawal is COVID related and no additional documentation would be needed from the student. Now, if the student did not go from ground-based to distance education, maybe they were enrolled in a solely online program, you cannot just assume that it's COVID related. You would need to get documentation from the student indicating why they're withdrawing and how it is related to COVID. Now, if the school has already returned funds for a student that would qualify for the waiver, the department is allowing you to take those back or to redisperse those. So if you have students that fall into this category, reach out to the compliance team and just email us at complianceteam@fasync.net and let us know that you have disbursements to be rescheduled. We are going to need the student's SID, their student ID, the fund source and the amount of funds that you want to reschedule. And we'll go ahead and get those rescheduled. They'll show up on your anticipated disbursement list and you can redisperse them at that point. If eligible disbursements had not been made prior to the last date of attendance, the school can make those disbursements and then process the R2T4. Now we have to keep in mind that they are saying that these have to be eligible disbursements. So in cases where a student was not dispersed their loans because they hadn't sat for 30 days, that would be a situation where those are not eligible disbursements. They can still be listed on the R2T4, but if they come up as post-withdrawal, they'll come up as post-withdrawal eligibility, but the student's still not eligible for them. So those you would not be able to disperse. So if you have any questions about what constitutes an eligible disbursement, certainly let us know and we can talk it over with you. Any waived refunds will not be adjusted on the student ledger. The original full amount of the disbursements will remain on the ledger. No adjustments on COD or G5. Once the school has completed the institutional refund calculation, there may be a credit balance due to the student on the ledger, and it may be a rather large credit balance in some cases. That credit balance does need to be paid to the student based on current cash management regulations, which is within 14 calendar days. So just make sure that you're adhering to those standards. The department has said that schools can look at adjusting their institutional refund calculation policy. However, that's typically governed by a state or accrediting agency. So you would certainly want to check with them before making any changes like that. Any refunds of Title IV grant overpayments or loan overpayments are waived, so the student would not need to be refunding those either. Now, the department says that you will need to report return of Title IV funds that are not, or ineligible funds that are not returned. So what they're going to be looking for is student identification information. We're not sure exactly what that is at this point just because of the PII involved. So we'll be looking for more information from the department on that. But you'll need some way to identify the student. You'll need the payment period begin and payment period end dates. So if you're a term school, pretty easy. It's just the beginning and end of your term that the student withdrew from. For non-term programs, it's a little bit harder to figure those out. So if you have any questions about how to figure out your payment period, start and end dates, definitely let us know and we can help you come up with those. The amount of Title IV grant or loan assistance that was received for the payment period. So you're going to want to report the full amount that the student received for that payment period. And then you'll also want to note the amount of any Title IV grant or loan assistance that was due to be returned, but the return was waived. Okay, and basically this reporting is going to be used by the department to so that they know which disbursements of loans need to be canceled, so that the SULA usage can be updated and the lifetime eligibility for Pell can also be updated. So there has been some question as to what about the students who withdrew during an eligible payment period, but there were no refunds due. So in those cases, we're going to recommend that you also keep track of those students. Even though there's technically no waived refund, you do want to make sure that those students get reported to the department so that their loan disbursements will be canceled and their LEU and SULA will be updated appropriately. FastLine, if FAS, I should say, if FAS processes your R2T4s, we normally will schedule your refunds under the refunds due tab. If you tell us that you are waiving those refunds, you'll want to make a note in the comments section of the R2T4 just saying waive refunds due to COVID or something to that effect. We will put those on the waived refund tab. We have a special refund reason code that we've created just for this purpose. So we'll assign it that reason code and that will put it on the waived refund tab rather than the refunds due tab. So it doesn't, what's out there on the waived refunds tab does not fulfill everything that the department is looking for, but it will at least give you a starting point to gather the information that you need for reporting. Verification of high school completion status. There's a little flexibility here. So if you have applicants who are in the B4 or B5 verification groups, the school is encouraged to use documentation that was obtained for other purposes within the school. So for example, if your admissions department had received a copy of a high school diploma or transcripts or something like that for purposes of admission, you can certainly get a copy of that from them, and that will cover what you need for high school completion status. If they do not have anything, if transcripts or high school diploma is not obtainable, the school can accept a signed and dated statement from the student in which he or she truthfully attests to his or her high school completion status. And the statement should include whether the high school diploma or equivalent was obtained and the date or approximate date of completion. For verification, if they're in the V4 or V5 verification groups, typically there is a requirement to provide documentation in person, and some of it needs to be notarized. So they are suspending those requirements. So schools can certainly allow applicants to submit verification documents electronically. Of course, a lot of these documents will contain PII, so you have to be really careful that if what you're sending out or what the student is sending back to you contains any sort of PII, it needs to be appropriately password protected. Or you have to use some sort of a secure file share or something to that effect. Schools can accept expired documentation as long as it expired after March 1st of 2020. And then the flexibilities also waive the requirement that a dependent student submit a statement signed by one of the student's parents when no responsible parent is available to provide that required signature. The institution has to document and retain an explanation of why neither of the student's parents was available to provide the signed statement. Campus-based waivers. So campus-based aid is your SEOG and your work study. The department is allowing schools to waive the non-federal share of both SEOG and work study for the 1920 and 2021 years. For SEOG, if a school paid out any SEOG disbursements on or after March 13th that included a non-federal share, you can reimburse yourself from the SEOG allocation for that non-federal share. And it just has to be disbursements that were made on or after March 13th. For work study, if a school paid out any wages that included a non-federal share on or after March 13th, you can reimburse yourself from the work study allocation for that non-federal share. And then finally, schools are allowed to move any unused federal work study funds to SEOG to provide emergency SEOG grants to students. Now, these grants do not have to follow your standard SEOG awarding rules, and they also are not counted as EFA, so they will not have to be added to your award letter. They won't affect subsidized loan eligibility or potentially put the student over cost of attendance. Leave of absence. So if students are unable or would prefer not to attend distance education, schools can place students on a leave of absence. The leave of absence must be requested in accordance with the school's published LOA policy, which typically includes that the request must be in writing and it must include the reason for the request. Now, there are some schools that don't have an LOA policy currently, so the department has said that schools can adopt a policy even on a temporary basis for the COVID reasons. These, unlike a normal LOA policy, which would require that the LOA be requested in writing prior to it beginning, the department has said that schools can place a student on leave of absence and get their written request at a later date. So it can be retroactive. Typically also, students are required to return at the same point that they stopped attending. That requirement has been removed as well. So that's more for a term-based school where it would be hard for students to take an LOA because it's hard for them to return to the same point. All right, and then we'll go over just some miscellaneous flexibilities that might affect your school. Accreditation visits, if you're going through a reaccreditation and a site visit would be required. The department is allowing accreditors to perform virtual site visits through the end of the year, December 31st, 2020. The on-site visit has to be followed in a reasonable time frame by an on-site visit has to follow in a reasonable time frame. They don't really say what reasonable is, so that's kind of open to interpretation, but you will need to have an on-site visit after the virtual visit. It does not have to repeat the entire review, and the department is giving some flexibility as far as which staff members from the accreditor can perform these visits. For your compliance and financial statement audits, the deadline for submission has been extended by 6 months. It's not entirely clear which how it's determined which audits this applies to, whether it's based on when the audit is due or when the audit period ends, that sort of thing. At this point, I think it's safe to assume that the audits that would have been due on 6/30 for year-end 12/31/19 will be extended by 6 months through the end of December. Otherwise, we're not really sure. I would say if your audit is due in the COVID-affected time frame, more than likely it will be extended, but check with your auditor and see what they have to say about it as well. And hopefully the department will provide some clarification on that. If you're going through change of ownership, Ed is allowing an additional 6 months for the submission of accreditor and state approvals, as well as the same-day balance sheet. So typically, I believe it's a month that schools are given to provide this documentation. And so you'll have an additional 6 months on top of that based on this flexibility. I'm not entirely sure whether MCATs are used by any of our client schools, but I did want to put it out there just in case. So the Ed has waived the MCAT requirement for foreign graduate medical school admissions for any students that are admitted to medical school during an admissions year in which the MCAT test is unavailable. So definitely make sure that you're documenting the unavailability of the MCAT test if you're going to allow someone to waive that. For the Paycheck Protection Program and its effect on composite scores, the Department of Ed is asking that schools report with their audited financial statements the actual or estimated amount of forgiveness of the PPP loans. And that amount should be attested to by your auditor. And what Ed will do is exclude this portion from the total liabilities and increase the institution's equity or net assets by the same amount in calculating the institution's composite scores. So it really should have no effect on your composite score. Student workers and PPP eligibility. The department says that schools must exclude work-study students when determining the number of employees for the PPP eligibility. And they also must exclude the payroll costs for work-study students from the calculation of payroll costs used to determine their loan amount. As far as the taxability of HEERF and emergency grants to students, the IRS has indicated that these funds will not be included as part of a student's gross income. There have also been some Title IV loan accommodations. So the department announced 0 interest and automatic forbearance through the end of September. This is automatic for all direct loans. If students have FFEL loans, they should contact their lender to make sure that this is in place. Also for defaulted loans, collections are ceasing through the end of September. This does not mean that the defaulted loan is going to go back into a good standing. It's still going to be a defaulted loan. They just won't be collecting on it through September 30th. So this includes any wage garnishments or tax return garnishments or anything like that. That will not happen through the end of September. Now, if you have a student whose loan is going through the rehabilitation process to get it out of default, any skipped payments will be counted as made payments through September 30th. And they're doing that just so the rehabilitation period won't be unnecessarily extended. Okay, so next thing we'll talk about is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So the first part, this Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund is basically split into 2 allocations. So the first one that you'll be applying for is the student allocation, which you will then figure out how you're going to award it to your students and disperse it to your students. The second piece is the institutional allocation, which are funds to assist the schools in covering costs associated with the disruption of study. So the student allocation we'll talk about first. This one was announced on April 9th, and that's when the schools began being able to apply for it. The application process, I'm sure most of you know that it's been kind of a nightmare. It's done on grants.gov, and there is a specific opportunity number for each grant. So for the student allocation, you want to make sure that you're applying for opportunity ed-grants-041020-003, and that will be for the student allocation. Once you find that, you'll get in and you should be able to apply for the grant opportunity. Now, there is a process by which you have to create a workspace. Unfortunately, FAS does not have access to do all of this stuff within grants.gov, so we're not really able to provide a whole lot of guidance, unfortunately, on this particular piece of the process. The grants.gov help desk, I'm told, is awesome with helping schools get set up and get their workspace in place and all of that. So if you run into any issues, call the grants.gov help desk and they will help to get you set up with your workspace so that you can get everything submitted. Once you have your workspace in place, you will be submitting SF-424, the SF-424 supplement, and you'll be uploading your signed certification and agreement for the student portion. Keep in mind that there are 2 entirely separate certification and agreements, one for the student and one for the institutional portion. So just make sure that you're uploading the correct one. Now I'm told with the SF-424 and the supplement, you can fill it out in one of 2 ways. You can either fill it out as a web form or you can print it to PDF and fill it out manually. From what I've heard, if you fill it out as a web form, any of the questions that don't apply to this particular grant will be inactive, so you won't be required to answer them. So it actually makes it a little bit easier because you're not trying to answer a question that really doesn't apply. So if you can fill it out that way, certainly do that. Otherwise, you'll have to print it to PDF, fill it out, and then upload it back in. Once everything is uploaded, I believe there's a certification process you need to go through just to make sure that everything's there that needs to be. Once it is, you'll submit it. You should receive an email pretty immediately saying that you've submitted your application, and they'll give you a tracking number. Not too long after that, you'll receive an email indicating that your application has been retrieved by the grantor. And the grantor is the Department of Ed in this case. So once they have it, then they're doing their review, and at some point after that, you should receive an email indicating that your application for the grant has been approved. And then usually a day or two after that, the funds become available in G5 and FAS can draw them down. Now, once you apply for these, you want to make sure that you let us know, send an email to compliance team at fastinc.net. Just let us know that you applied so that we can add you to our tracking list and make sure that we're keeping an eye on G5 to draw those funds down. A couple of helpful hints that I've gotten from working with clients on this process along the way. Make sure that your DUNS, well, make sure that you're using the right DUNS, first of all, the one that's on your e-car. We found out that numerous schools have had more than one DUNS number, and the one that they applied with was not the one on their e-car, and it's creating some issues. So make sure that you're using the one that's on your e-car, and make sure the status in SAM.gov is active. Okay, so it may not prohibit you from actually applying for the grant, but if your status in SAM.gov is not active, we won't be able to get the funds to you. We'll be able to draw them down, but they're going to go into a hold status until you're active on SAM.gov. So make sure up front that that's in place. That way there's no delay on the back end. I've also been told that on the home screen or the login screen of grants.gov, right below the login section, there's a link to log in as eBiz POC. And there's something in that section that either allows you to create the workspace or gives you permission to use the workspace or something like that. But if you're stuck at any point, you might want to try logging in as the eBiz POC with your login information and see if that helps you out. When all else fails, or if you just don't want to take guesses, call grants.gov help desk at the number on this slide. I'm told that they're very, very helpful. So it'll probably save you a lot of time in the long run to just reach out to them. Now, this slide is from the cares.gov website, or the CARES Act website, I should say. It has pretty much everything that you need to know about the HEERF fund for students. It's got tips for applying. It's got the initial letter from the secretary that has a little bit of information about what the funds are intended for. The certificate of agreement is there if you need to print a copy to sign and upload. The formula allocations, which include the list of allocations for the schools, as well as the methodology that the department used for calculating the allocations. There's also the frequently asked questions, which is where the department has given some of the clarification and also created some of the confusion that's gone along with awarding these grants. So when you get a copy of this PowerPoint, all of these links are active, so you should just be able to click on them and they'll bring you right to the page that you're looking for. So a few things about awarding the student allocation. The school will need to create an awarding policy, and that will indicate how they'll determine what each student is eligible for. The department is asking that you don't place undue burden on the students, so you really can't make them jump through hoops to get these funds. It has to be as easy for them as possible. It cannot be used to cover any outstanding balances due to the school, so whatever you determine is going to be their eligible amount, that needs to be sent to them in full. Even if you end up running them through the ledgers to keep track, it can't be used to cover any balance on that ledger. Now, CQ, which is the Career Education Colleges and Universities, has created an awarding guide, which is an amazing resource. It has some information about what these funds can be used for, some different guidelines as to how to create your awarding policy. It's got some application templates, and it's even got a small section on using the institutional allocation. So we strongly encourage you to check out this guide. And again, the link is live, so it should take you right to their awarding guide and read through it. If you haven't already created your awarding policy, it's probably going to be a great help to you. Now, one thing I want to stress about these funds, because there has been some confusion on this, is that the funds are to be awarded to students who experience expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to coronavirus. So a lot of schools are thinking these funds are supposed to go to any student who's been affected in any way, shape, or form by coronavirus, and that's just not the case, unfortunately. So if you have a student who was laid off or has additional medical expenses or something like that, that is not a basis for them to receive these funds. That's a basis for them to receive maybe unemployment or something like that, but not the HEERF funds. So the HEERF funds have to be given to students who experience expenses related to the disruption of campus operations. That's really important to remember, and that should be the basis of your awarding. Expenses related to the disruption of campus operations is pretty vague, really. Something to think about would be students who maybe had to buy a laptop or a computer to be able to do distance education. Maybe they had to increase their data plan for their internet usage. They're home all day, so their electric bill has gone up, or their heating or air conditioning bill has gone up, or something like that. So those can be argued as expenses related to the disruption of campus operations. So in order to award these students, you have to be able to support that they did experience expenses such as these. And then you can go from there as far as if they've lost a job, maybe the student, John lost his job, so he's got a little bit more need than Joe, who did not lose his job. So maybe you award a little bit more to John than you did to Joe. So you'll need to kind of gauge where your students are at, if they have these expenses related to campus disruption, and then if you want to go the route of giving students who demonstrate need a little bit more, you can certainly do that. These funds are not included as revenue for 90/10. And then the funds cannot be used by the school for reimbursement of any expenses except for one. If the school used institutional funds to make emergency grants to students on or after 3/27, you can reimburse yourself for that. So what that means is that if, excuse me, if one of your students was, in a rough patch and it needed a little bit of money and you decided to give that student an emergency grant on the 30th of March, say you gave them $300. Well, when you determine eligibility under your awarding policy, that student is eligible for $500. So you can reimburse yourself $300 and then pay the student the additional $200. So that's how that would work. But that's the only time you can reimburse yourself for anything under the student allocation. Okay, so eligibility for the student allocation. There's been some confusion on this, and the department created confusion, unfortunately. So initially, the department released the Q&A, and in the Q&A, it said that students who are or could be eligible to participate in programs under Section 484 of the HEA are eligible for these funds, and that's it. So Section 484 of the HEA requires that students be enrolled or accepted for enrollment in a degree, certificate, or other program leading to a recognized educational credential at an eligible institution. They need to be maintaining satisfactory progress, not owe a refund on grants, not be in default on any student loans. They have to have signed a statement of educational purpose, provide documentation of their social security number, be a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen, must not have been convicted of Title IV fraud, and can't be enrolled in a solely online program. So based on that Q&A, only students who meet these criteria would be eligible. They don't necessarily have to have a FAFSA on file. It is the easiest way to document that they meet all of these criteria, but it's not a requirement. If they do not have a FAFSA on file, you would need to document each of these items individually. outside of the FAFSA. So you could just have them fill out a FAFSA and be done with it, but if you don't, then you would need to document each of these items. Now, that being said, on 5/21, the department, they did not send out an electronic announcement or anything real official. They just posted this on the CARES Act website. And it's kind of contradictory, in our opinion. But basically, it says that question 9 of the HEERF student FAQ document is basically unenforceable by law. So it says that the department will not initiate any enforcement action based solely on these statements because they lack the force and effect of law. However, right down below, it also says that the department reiterates its guidance that emergency financial aid grants under Section 18004C of the CARES Act may only be given to students who are or could be eligible to participate in the programs under Section 484 of the HEA. That, in our opinion, kind of contradicts itself. So schools are welcome to award as they would like. If you choose to award to students who do not meet Section 484 eligibility, we do recommend that you reach out to your school's legal counsel and just make sure that you're covered. See what they have to say about any potential issues that you could run into in the future. I actually, an email came across my desk today from AACS that seemed to indicate that the department was trying to get these eligibility requirements published in the Federal Register. If that happens, we don't know at this point if it will, but if that happens, anything in the Federal Register is enforceable by law. So what will happen if that happens, we don't know at this point. So as soon as we have any more information on that, we will let you know. But certainly we suggest that you err on the side of caution, and we don't want to see you having to return money later that the department decides went to students that it shouldn't have. All right, so as far as reporting, the department has told us from the very beginning that we would be required to report how these funds are used. So we've been waiting and waiting and waiting to see how that reporting would happen. On May 6th, they released some interim guidance indicating the method by which schools are going to be reporting for the time being, at least. So these items they want put into a disclosure document and posted to the student or posted to the school's website. So these need to include an acknowledgement that the institution signed and returned the certification and agreement, and an assurance that the institution has used or intends to use no less than 50% of the funds to provide emergency financial aid grants to students. Number 2, the total amount of funds that the institution will receive. So this is the amount of the student allocation. The total amount of emergency financial aid grants that were distributed to students as of the date of submission of this disclosure on your website. So you're required to report within 30 days of receiving the funds in G5, and then every 45 days thereafter. So when you report at 30 days, if you haven't dispersed anything yet, you'll put 0 here. If you've dispersed everything, great, you'll put the full amount. And then if you hadn't dispersed everything at the 30-day mark, then you'll want to continue to update that every 45 days to make sure until everything has been dispersed. Number 4 is the total estimated number of students at the institution that are eligible to participate in programs under Section 484 and thus eligible to receive emergency financial aid grants to students. Number 5 is the total number of students who have received an emergency financial aid grant at the point of the reporting. And then the methods used by the institution to determine which students will receive the emergency financial aid grant. So this would basically be the policy that you come up with. Number 7 is the final one, any instructions, directions, or guidance that are given to the students concerning the emergency financial aid grants. So if you, with the check to the student, you send a letter or something like that, you'll want to have a copy of that. If there's any sort of application that they sign, pretty much anything that you'll give to them as a result of the emergency financial aid grants, you'll want to make sure that you have copies of that included with your disclosure. All right, so now we'll talk about the institutional allocation. This one was announced on April 21st. That's when schools began being able to apply for it. The application process is exactly the same as with the student portion. The only difference really is that you're using this different opportunity number. So the opportunity number for the institutional grant is ed-grants dash 042120-004. So just make sure you're choosing that one for the institutional allocation. You're going to submit SF 424, the SF 424 supplement, and upload the signed statement, the signed certification and agreement for the institutional portion. So again, remember there's two separate ones for the student and institutional. Make sure that you're submitting the institutional here. And before you apply for the institutional allocation, you have to have already applied for the student portion. That's very important. So make sure that you've applied for the 041020-003 first. It doesn't have to have paid out already, you just have to have submitted the application. Okay, and this page has live links to all of the department's information on the institutional portion, the letter from the secretary, which has some information about how the funds are intended to be used, the certificate of agreement, if you need to print it out and sign it again, and then the allocation information is here as well. There is a frequently asked question document that can also give you some ideas about how the funds should be spent. Now, with the institutional allocation, it is to be used to cover any costs associated with significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus, except for making payments to contractors for recruitment activities, including marketing and advertising. It cannot be used for endowments or capital outlays associated with facilities related to athletics, sectarian instruction, or religious worship. Some of the allowable uses that we've heard are reimbursement of room and board, tuition, and other fees as a result of significant changes. So if you've refunded any costs for room and board, tuition, or other fees because you had to cancel classes or something like that, you should be able to reimburse yourself for that. If you had any costs to purchase equipment or software, pay online licensing fees, or to pay for internet service to enable a transition to distance learning, those sorts of things can be covered as well. If you purchased any computers or other equipment to donate to students in order to enable them to attend distance education, these purchases would have had to have been made on or after March 13th, but those costs can be reimbursed as well. Any costs associated with administering the student portion of the HEERF funds, what I've heard from schools is that if they opened another account, the cost to open that account or the cost for the checks that they had to buy, they're covering with these funds. Some schools are using payment apps like a Venmo. There are fees associated with that, so those fees can be covered with these funds as well. And these funds can also be used to make additional emergency grants to students. So that is everything that we had to go over. We are taking questions. We will create a question and answer document that will be uploaded to our website with this PowerPoint and this recorded webinar. So it'll be available for you to review. But again, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to give a call to the office. Anyone on the compliance team can assist you with questions on the CARES Act or Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Or if you want to email complianceteam@fasync.net, we can also get back to you that way. Thank you so much again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and enjoy your day. Thanks.